Today, we're excited to launch a new series specifically on the virtues, and we're joined by Dr. Luke Arredondo.
And what we talk about today is what is virtue, the difference between the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues, and why should we even care about living a life of virtue. This is going to be a fun one, and we hope that you enjoy.
Welcome to Life Beyond the Chariot, a faith and family series from the St. Philip Institute. We believe we are called to not only know, but also to live the truth of the gospel within our homes, in our workplaces, and beyond. We believe we are invited to encounter Christ in the messiness of day-to-day life and to live as his disciples.
Hi, welcome to the St. Philip Institute podcast. My name is Luke Arredondo, and I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at the St. Philip Institute, and I am joined in this episode by Miss Deanna Johnson, who is our Director of Marriage and Family Life, and Miss Mickey Seba, our catechetical expert here. We have a really special episode today, which is why all three of us are here. We have shifted over the last couple of months into a different strategy for what our podcasts are going to do. You may have noticed over the last couple of months we did a focus on the Eucharist. There were some episodes that I hosted on the St. Philip Institute podcast and some that Mickey and Deanna hosted on the Life Beyond the Chariot podcast. And we're today launching a new series on the virtues. Deanna, you want to kind of explain sort of how that's going to work?
Yeah. So on the St. Philip Institute podcast, I think Luke has done a really great job of unpacking the theology of a lot of the different themes that we're trying to approach. So on the St. Philip Institute podcast, we're going to look at virtue. The theological virtues is what you're going to be approaching. And then on the Life Beyond the Chariot podcast, Mickey and I will be unpacking the cardinal virtues, the human virtues, and the practical application of that. Because it's really beautiful to look at the teachings of the church, but to actually take that teaching and apply it. So I think between the three of us, we will be unpacking virtue in a really awesome way over the next 8 weeks.
Yeah, so it's going to be 1 week of Life Beyond the Chariot and then a week of the St. Philip Institute podcast like it normally is, but they're all going to be thematically connected. And we did this with the Eucharist series, but we're trying to be a little bit more clear and upfront this time as we're learning how to make more professional podcasts, how our two are relating. So Deanna and Mickey will be covering the cardinal virtues one at a time. Over 4 episodes, and I'll have 3 episodes, one on faith, one on hope, and one on charity. But today's the introductory episode to the series, and we wanted to cover just a couple of real basic things about like why spend 8 weeks doing a podcast on virtues. So maybe we could start with defining like what is virtue. We know there's some cardinal virtues and then theological virtues, but what is a virtue? So who wants to define what is a virtue?
Go for it, man.
Mickey's our expert.
I was like, oh, he called me an expert. That makes me a little nervous. I say we'll read from the Catechism and then sort of break that down. So in Catechism paragraph 1803, it says, a virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. It allows the person not only to perform good acts, but to give the best of himself. The virtuous person tends toward the good with all his sensory and spiritual powers. He pursues the good and chooses it in concrete actions. And I think what's going to make, or what I'm really excited about, is because the practical application is choosing to practice these things and to grow in these things in very concrete ways, which I know is something that sometimes I struggle with, taking, a definition in the church and then applying it to daily life. When I used to teach this to my high schoolers, I would just say it's a good spiritual habit. Because when we started talking about like a firm and habitual disposition to the good, they were like, what does that even mean? So we might even have some audience that are like, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah. I think one good thing to do is to distinguish between the way we normally use the word habit and what St. Thomas Aquinas or the Catechism means by a firm and habitual disposition to do the good. Like there is this notion of habit in Aquinas when he talks about the virtues. He says it's a habit, but Aquinas means something very different from how we normally use the word habit. So I think most of the time in English today, when we say someone has a habit, it means it's something that they do without thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I put my phone on the counter by habit. I didn't pay attention to what I was doing, and then later I don't know where it is. My kids put the remote in a stupid place by habit, and then we can't find it, and they're not conscious about it. Habits mostly for people today mean things that we do without thinking, without choosing. It's just a habit. And virtues are a habit, but they are not at all something we do without thinking or without choosing and just kind of stumble into. So from our perspective as Catholics, what we mean about a virtue is that it is a choice that we are making. And when you're a virtuous person, it's easy to make that choice. So it might seem like, it was really, you weren't thinking very hard about it, but it is a conscious choice nonetheless. And it's work in a lot of ways, and sometimes it's grace, if we're talking about cardinal or theological virtues. But forming the good habit, forming the virtue can be very hard work. Once you achieve it, then living that out looks easy from the outside, but it's not.
Right.
And I think sometimes when we read about the lives of the saints, it makes it seem like, well, that was pretty easy. Like they just never committed a mortal sin. Like, wow, I want to be like Saint Therese one day, you know. But there's work involved in some of these. So does that help?
I think so. And I was just thinking, I recently ordered a book called The Atomic Power of a Habit. And I can't remember who the author is, but I just bought it. And it's reminding me of how, like, we live in a culture that is very big on quick fixes, and that all you need is this program and you'll transform your life. But by virtue of our baptism, that we have access to these virtues, and the sacraments help us to live these out more concretely, that we should be living differently. Like, yes, it's really great that you can form a habit in however many days it takes to form a habit, but that virtue is actually taking that to the next level. And if you want to live a healthy, happy, holy life, virtue has to be part of it.
Yeah. For me in high school, and actually my first attempt at going to college is I was going to be a music major. I was a music major. Trumpet playing was like my whole life in high school. I don't know what normal people...
Did you have a bumper sticker that said trumpet playing is life?
Even worse, I had a bumper sticker on my trumpet case. Okay, nobody ever saw it but me. I don't really know what the function of it was, but I had a bumper sticker on my trumpet case. Trumpet playing was my life, and I focused and worked really hard obsessively about all kinds of details, and I was okay at it. You know, I got a scholarship and whatever. I'm trying to relearn how to play the trumpet now, like finally as like a regular person who just wants to have like a little bit of a hobby. And I recognize now, after the space of some 20 years of being a serious trumpet player, that I don't know how to breathe. And I remember I spent years like with a metronome and measuring how much air I could take in one breath and how quickly I could expel it. Like, I practiced and exercised that function of taking a breath for years. And now that I'm out of shape with it, I have to think really hard about it and try really hard. So I may have had a virtue, one, and that was I could take a good breath on my instrument, right? That was a lot of work to build that habit to become seamless and easy, but it wasn't automatic for me. And you said something about baptism. So let's get into this distinction between cardinal and theological virtues, because there is a very big distinction between those. So, Mickey, what are the cardinal virtues?
Prudence, man, I feel like you put me on the spot. Prudence, temperance.
Because I don't know them, so I would ask you.
Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude.
Okay, so those are cardinal virtues. And what the church teaches about those is that these are natural and human virtues, natural and human powers that we all have some sort of access to. We all have like a capacity for. And we're called to strengthen those.
Yeah.
Virtue is a perfection of these powers, right? So we're either not prudent or we're prudent. It's not like you can't like get yourself out of that conversation. Like, I don't have to deal with prudence or temperance or fortitude. Like, nah, it's okay. I'm not into that. You are into it.
I wasn't given that gift. Yeah.
You might be bad at it because you don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
But you can't step out of the conversation. Yeah. So as a human being, how can we grow in the virtues, in the cardinal virtues? What does it take to grow in those?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
Just practicing them first, knowing what they are.
Yes, that's a big thing.
So knowing sort of the good that you're striving for, and then being able to recognize when you're being called to practice that. You know, like if we know patience, on my way here, I was like, Lord, if you could make every single light green, that'd be really great. That did not happen. And I was in the fast lane. I was going the speed limit, but I was behind someone who was choosing to be more cautious, which is fine. But it's like recognizing like, okay, I know what patience is. Am I going to practice it? And it is, and the more that you practice these things, the more like consistently, the more you can practice it with ease. And hopefully we can get to a point where we can practice them with consistency, with ease, and with joy. And so that would be the goal, as we practice these virtues. But it just comes like with working on them. Like for, how do you teach a kid to draw? Well, you learn to draw by drawing, and then you just perfect those skills. I'm sure you learn
that's really good.
To play the trumpet. I mean, you have to you have to pick it up and just start playing,
Yeah.
So you could read all of these books about virtue, and you could know everything, but there comes, everything on an intellectual level, but there's something that comes to the very practical living it out. And then...
That's really good. That distinction between knowing and doing is really important with the virtues. So what we do not want this podcast series to do is merely get you to understand intellectually and define what all these different virtues are. That is important only so that you can then go and do it. All right. So this is the difference between the intellectual aspect of the virtues and the volitional, or the cognitional and the volitional. Knowing it is not the same as choosing it, is not the same as doing it. So we have to know, and then we also have to choose. So Deanna, you mentioned baptism. How does baptism change the way that we approach even the cardinal virtues?
Mickey can explain this better than I can, but based off of what I understand, that we're given these virtues, the theological virtues, just by virtue of our baptism. Like they're infused into us, and that they're more. Is it true to say like it's more relational with like our relationship with God? And but you can unpack that a lot better than I can, Mickey.
Well, no, I would even say just from like a very simplistic plane is that in baptism, we have now access to God's grace. Like his life is now within us. So whether, like with the theological virtues, you can't practice those into habit, which I'm sure you'll explain in a minute. And the cardinal virtues, you can practice those. Like you learn those by doing them. But in all of these, we have access to God's grace, which is something that we need as humans to perfect our soul towards the good, right? Which is ultimately like holiness, which is ultimately union with God and heaven. And so without having God's grace to push us and move us towards the good, it's an impossible task.
Yeah, all of the virtues, all the cardinal virtues, anybody should be able to improve in those, even if they're not baptized. We don't believe you can grow in faith, hope, and charity apart from baptism, right? Some kind of baptism, I'll say that. Could be a baptism of desire. So we don't really want to be saying, if you have not been experienced a water baptism, you couldn't possibly have faith. You could. The church does believe in baptism of desire. But without God's grace, we're not going to have faith, hope, and charity. We can't. It is infused. It is given to us. It is supernatural. And then we do have human work to do to grow in that, right? So part of the discussion about virtues, I think it actually circles into like, what is Catholic moral theology fundamentally concerned with? And it's concerned with what Mickey said, the end, which is union with God in heaven. And the way that we get there is going to have something to do with the way we live our lives here. Yeah. Now, I think a lot of people hear virtue and they go, isn't that like, well, that's not an important thing. That's like some obscure thing. Like being a holy person is about following the commandments, right? I gotta maybe this would be a better way to say it. Nearly everybody would go, yeah, to be holy, you have to live the commandments. But I'm not so sure if you have to develop virtues, right? But that's not correct. Actually, something really fascinating about the Catechism there, we've got this cool Australian version of it. And if you're watching the video version, you're really getting a treat right now with the green, small, single volume Catechism you can only get from Australia that I'm so jealous that Deanna has. The organization of the Catechism is into 4 parts, right? It starts with the Creed, and then it goes to life in Christ, right? And life in Christ is, or maybe it's sacraments or second, whatever. Life in Christ is one of the sections. That's about the moral life. Mm-hmm. It does not start with the commandments. It starts with, anybody want to take a guess?
I'll
starts
do the
with
drum
V, rhymes with virtue. It starts with virtue. That's a really big deal.
Yeah.
As I've been trying to do some background work, I don't really know much about virtue, so I'm trying to read like all these books as we prepare for these podcasts. Mm-hmm. As I've been doing some background work, one of the things that really stood out to me is the Catechism of the Council of Trent or the Baltimore Catechism, earlier catechisms would go straight to the commandments. Thomas Aquinas didn't go straight to the commandments in his discussion of the moral life. Mm-hmm. He started with virtues. And the new Catechism of the Catholic Church from 1982 returns us to that older tradition. And I think that's a really important thing to emphasize. It is not that, wow, the moral life used to be about following commandments, and now we're doing all this stuff about virtue. But actually, the older tradition is to talk about virtue. You have a great quote from St. Gregory of Nyssa.
Yeah.
What's his quote?
The goal of the virtuous life is to become like God, St. Gregory of Nyssa, which is in the very first paragraph in this section in the Catechism. And I'm also just kind of blown away as I'm unpacking all of this, because I'm also learning about virtue for the first time probably, or just like refreshing my CCD or my Catholic education. But the fact that there's an emphasis in this introduction to the virtues on also dependence on God's mercy, on God's grace, and that the sacraments help us to do this better. Yep. It's like God didn't just throw us in the deep end and say, good luck, please be virtuous. But the fact that we have confession, that we have the Eucharist, that we have these things that will help us to infuse just to become more virtuous, that it's not just that we're on our own, that we're not going to be able to develop this on our own. It's totally dependent on God's grace to help us.
Yeah, so there is the distinction between the cardinal and the theological virtues, and the cardinal are natural and the theological are supernatural or infused. However, with the grace of baptism and the other sacraments, that also makes it easier for us to grow in even those natural human virtues. Right. And that's really important. So to be temperate or just, or to have fortitude, or to have whatever the fourth cardinal virtue is, you need prudence. You need to try, but also grace is going to build on that, right? Grace perfects nature. I think there's a danger sometimes in talking in Catholic circles or in people who are really concerned with the spiritual life to say like, well, you've got to pray and you've got to go to confession, which you do need to do.
Absolutely.
Right.
But that's not, in most cases, going to just flip on a switch and then like, oh, now I can just be perfectly temperate or prudent. It's both of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the virtues help us to have intention behind the rules, if that makes sense. Or like, yes, we have to follow the commandments like you were saying, Luke, but to have that intention of just being a better human. Like we could really call this series like how to be a better person, how to be the best version of yourself. Yeah. That's what the virtues do.
It was once explained to me that living the virtuous life makes you free to be human, like completely free to be human. So like if you are focusing on growing in virtue and that it has become your focus, it's almost as if you don't really need to look at the 10 Commandments. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so the commandments are when like your passions, your intellect, your will are weak and you're not focusing and being intentional, that there's this like caution sign or this stop sign like you can't do this. And so if we're working on, like if I'm working on temperance, then wanting to be intemperate or fall into like gluttony or sins of lust, those tend to diminish the more I'm working on temperance,
Right.
And so the thing is, like, if we are, and I guess I love the shift, not away from the 10 Commandments, because we need them, right? The commandments,
Sure.
but we tend to not need these things. Like, I don't need the fifth commandment, you shall not kill. I don't desire to kill anybody. Do you know what I mean? And I need to perfect my love, so that I'm not like really frustrated with the person who cut me off or is going 40 in a 60, so I can perfect that. I can learn to be more loving, but
Right.
I don't need that. And so when we come to, like, I don't need to be reminded of all these restrictions, because I'm actually freely living the way that God has intended me to live. And I think that's the beauty of the virtues. And why I'm excited to get back into this, because I need to be reminded, because it's in the everyday that you either succeed at this or you fail epically, which I've done plenty of times in the past,
Right.
in home life. So
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important, again, is that like everybody needs to be aware of the virtues, right? Because that's where we're all called to get to, is to that deeper point. And there's the 3 ages of the spiritual life. You're in the purgative way at the beginning, where mortal sin is a real problem in your life, and you're trying to get at least past that threshold where I'm not struggling with mortal sin on a regular basis anymore. That if you do can continue to struggle with it at all, it's very minor, very infrequent, right? You move from the purgative way into the unitive way, or into the illuminative way, and then into the unitive way. And that illuminative way and the unitive way, those are characterized by deepening the virtues. So by merely not sinning, that doesn't actually make you a saint. Just
You should repeat that.
Just to not be sinning. Like, I didn't do anything bad. Or let's say mortally sin.
Yeah.
By just not mortally sinning, that's not the height of sanctity.
right.
That's like, you can start working on it now. You can start making some progress and going somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what the virtues are there for, is to help us to grow in that. And I think too, like the freedom, that's a great way to say it. Like, virtues free us to be morally excellent, to be spiritually excellent. It's like if I don't have any athletic ability at all, but if you look at amazing athletes, they're doing a lot more than like dribbling with the proper form or following the rules that the league has in place. They are doing all of those things. They have embodied those and like internalized all of that. And they're then pursuing things that nobody even imagined you could do, and it is a stunning and like, it's like an artistic sort of thing to see a true, all-star athlete like at their best and the best of their career. It's just so exciting and thrilling, because it's like, you can't imagine someone doing that. And a saint is holy in that sort of way. One of the things that's common in discussions about the virtues is to say, for instance, prudence, right? Prudence is like the middle way. A virtue is the middle way. It's the mean. It's in between being utterly imprudent or just jumping, indecisive or jumping straight into something, right? Being reckless or indecisive. Prudent is sort of in between those, and that's true. But the spiritual life that we're really called to is not merely just like a mean, in between state, but something that even goes in an utterly different direction. So like, Mother Teresa didn't love people just the right amount. She wasn't like, oh, lazy, or oh, I'm loving them too much. I'm loving them like right in the middle. So the saints actually, they both find that human dimension of being right in the middle, but then the supernatural dimension that comes with grace allows them to go. Imagine calling St. Francis of Assisi like, yeah, he walked right down the middle. It's like, people don't think that way about the saints, because once they get to that basic level of virtue, then grace can pull them even further, or push them. I don't know if it's a push or a pull, maybe both. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
This is going to be a fun series.
Yeah. So this is what we're trying to do over these next few weeks. Is again, Mickey and Deanna and Life Beyond the Chariot are going to do a series of 4 episodes on each of the cardinal virtues. So you'll start with prudence, then justice, Does anybody know what comes next?
Temperance and then
Temperance
fortitude
and
is last.
fortitude.
Yeah, I forget the order, but I think
On
that's
the St. Philip Institute podcast, I will be talking about faith, then hope, then charity. And that's the goal for us, is to really lay out some of these terms, what the church means, but then also give you access, into this world, and to invite you into it, because the virtues are not just for experts, and believe, which is good because I'm not an expert. The virtues are for all of us, right? And especially by virtue of our baptism, those theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are where we're all really called to grow deeper. So I hope you enjoy these next several weeks. Our first episode will be with Life Beyond the Chariot. So look for that episode coming soon on prudence, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.